Hi guys. Today in our last new lesson, we're going to focus on the specific part of the quadratic formula that's called the discriminant. The discriminant is going to help us figure out what type of answer we should expect to get. And that'll help us make sure that we get the right type of answer when we're using the quadratic formula. Just to quickly review some vocabulary words, a quadratic equation looks like this. It is in what we call standard form, where we have ax squared plus bx plus c, that's in descending order, and the a, the b, and the c are all numbers. And it is an equation, so it has to equal something, and it has to equal 0. That is mandatory. If it equals anything else, it's not in the correct format. One method we can use to solve a quadratic equation is the quadratic formula. We started learning this about a week ago. We've been doing quadratic formula for 4 days now. You do need to memorize the quadratic formula before we take our test next week, so make sure that you're working on memorizing it. I taught you last week on Thursday's first video, I think. We learned a song or a story to help you with that. And again, the quadratic formula is a way to solve the quadratic equation. Today we're focusing on something called the discriminant. And the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. It's the part that's underneath the square root sign of the quadratic formula. Notice it does not include the actual square root sign. It's just the math underneath it. This is also the formula that we were practicing in our live class session on Tuesday. So we were already practicing working with this during class. The discriminant will tell us how many answers we will have. Will we have 2 answers? Will we have 1 double root? Or will it be no solution? And it can be kind of fancy. It can tell us what our answers are going to look like. It can tell us if our answers are going to be nice whole numbers or crazy decimals or things like that. So that's what the discriminant is. And again, the discriminant is from the underneath part of the quadratic formula. Now we need to be careful. The discriminant does not tell us what the actual answers are, because as you can see, it's just like partway through the quadratic formula. So it's not going to tell us the real answers. It'll just tell us what they might look like. There are 4 scenarios that can happen when you're working with the discriminant. So scenario number 1 is you will get 2 real rational roots. Real numbers, at this point in time in your life, everything is a real number. You will eventually learn about numbers that are not real in your Algebra 2 class, but that's a couple years down the road. So 2 real answers. Rational means that you will get nice, pretty answers for this one. So you'll get whole numbers like 3 or 4 or -10, or it's possible you can get a fraction like 1/2 or 3/4 or something like that, but they're really, really nice numbers. When you get 2 real rational roots, your discriminant would be a positive perfect square. So we have to remember that the discriminant is from the underneath part of the square root sign. So if I'm doing a math problem and I have my number underneath the square root problem, so we're talking this part right here, okay? So that part right there. If that number is a perfect square, then the square root sign will go away because you'll be able to square root it and you'll be left with all nice, pretty numbers. So if your discriminant is a perfect square, then you should get nice answers, whole numbers or fractions, and there should be 2 of them. Here's a sample of what the answers might look like. Now, our second scenario is also 2 real roots, but this time they're going to be irrational. So an irrational number is a never-ending, never-repeating decimal. And that happens when we try to take the square root of a number that's not a perfect square. So this would be if your discriminant is a positive number that's not a perfect square. So that would be like, maybe this number is 17. Well, I don't know the square root of 17. That would give me a not pretty answer. It's going to give you a decimal answer. So this would be a scenario where it would be okay to get decimal answers. So if this number underneath the square root is not a perfect square, you are going to get two answers, but they're going to be decimals and you're going to have to round. If it is a perfect square, then you should get either whole numbers or fractions. So that's our second scenario. Now, in both of those scenarios, you got two answers. For our next scenario, we're only going to get one answer, and this is when you get a double root. So a double root, if we were factoring, it would come from a perfect square trinomial, because then you would have like the same parentheses twice. And a double root happens when your discriminant is the number 0. This is the only time it'll be a double root. So think about it. If my discriminant is 0, then I'm going to take the square root of 0, which is 0. And then I'm going to add 0, and I'm going to subtract 0, and that doesn't do anything, because adding and subtracting 0 does nothing. So that's why we only get one answer. So if your number under the square root sign is the number 0, then you will get one answer. It's going to be a double root. So this is the time where you would write just one number and put a DR after it. That means that you got the same answer twice. I got positive 4 for my first answer, and I got positive 4 for my second answer as well. Now, our last scenario is maybe there are no answers. Maybe there are 0 real roots. And this happens when we try to square root a negative. So this was in Tuesday's video. If you try to square root a negative, your calculator gives you an error message because it's not possible to square root a negative. So if the number under the square root sign is negative, then you know that that problem has no real answers, and your answer you would write on the answer line is no solution. So if you ever get a negative under here, it's going to be no solution. Now, we're not going to do any of the black parts of this. Today, we're just doing the red part, just the b squared minus 4ac. And so that's going to tell us how many answers we're going to get. Also, I'm not going to worry too much about the vocabulary words. I'm just going to focus on how many answers are you going to get. 2 answers, 1 answer, or no answers. So we'll do some examples in our second video of finding the discriminant and then stating how many answers there are.